sterile hum of the server racks was the only constant companion in my lay tower vigil, a metallic breath in the hushed cathedral of commerce. My office, a glass-walled alcove overlooking the city's slumbering sprawl, usually offered a serene canvas for my meticulous work. Tonight, however, the familiar panorama of twinkling lights felt less like solace and more like a distant, indifferent gaze. I was Thomas, and numbers were my language, my refuge, my truth. They rarely lied. And when they did, their deceit was often a clumsy, telltale stutter. My fingers, worn smooth from years of tapping across keyboards, danced over the illuminated keys, navigating spreadsheets like a seasoned cartographer charting unknown territories. The current expedition involved the accounts of Veridian Global Holdings, a client whose reputation shimmered with an almost ethereal glow, reflecting the firm's own polished prestige. A routine quarterly audit, the kind I'd executed hundreds of times, a rhythmic ballet of debits and credits, assets and liabilities. Yet tonight, the rhythm felt off-kilter, a discordant note echoing in the silent data streams. It began subtly, a faint tremor beneath the surface of impeccable ledgers. A series of intercompany transfers, perfectly balanced, impeccably documented. My mind, a finely tuned instrument for detecting dissonance, registered a whisper of unease. Figures themselves were unremarkable, mere conduits moving capital between subsidiaries, but their sheer volume, their relentless frequency across various obscure entities, pricked at my professional intuition. Veridian Global dealt in high-value assets, yes, but this intricate web of internal circulation felt excessive. I leaned closer, my breath misting the cool glass of the monitor. The fluorescent glow cast my face in stark relief, highlighting the furrow in my brow. I cross-referenced the transaction dates, the amounts, the recipient accounts. Each pathway was a dead end, leading to another shell company, each with a bland, generic name: Horizon Ventures Limited, Apex Solutions Group, Pacific Rim Investments. The names themselves were innocuous, designed to blend into the vast ocean of corporate registries. But it was the addresses that started to unravel the carefully woven fabric. Post office boxes in offshore havens, shared virtual offices, a single street address listing dozens of seemingly unrelated entities. "Wait," I murmured, my voice a low rasp in the quiet office. "That doesn't add up." The initial doubt, a fleeting shadow, solidified into a cold certainty. My fingers flew, opening new windows, cross-referencing public records, tracing the convoluted ownership structures. Each click, each search result pulled back a layer of the onion, revealing a deeper, more unsettling core. The beneficial owners of these shell companies were obscured behind layers of trusts and nominees, a labyrinthine structure designed for maximum anonymity. Yet a pattern emerged. The same few names, or rather, the same few proxies for names, reappeared, linked by subtle threads that only a forensic eye would catch. A shared legal counsel here, a common registered agent there, a recurring set of numbered bank accounts in different jurisdictions. My heart, usually a steady metronome, began to beat with a more insistent rhythm. This wasn't merely aggressive tax avoidance or creative accounting. This was an orchestrated obfuscation, a deliberate attempt to conceal the true origin and destination of colossal sums of money. The amounts, when aggregated across the various entities and timelines, swelled into figures that made my stomach clench. Millions, then tens of millions, then hundreds of millions, flowing through this intricate, almost beautiful network of deception. I remembered a conversation from earlier in the week, a casual remark from a senior partner, their eyes distant as they spoke of the firm's invaluable relationship with Veridian Global. "Don't rock the boat, Thomas," the partner had said, their tone light, but the underlying current of warning unmistakable. "They are sensitive clients." At the time, I dismissed it as typical corporate politeness. Now, the memory settled like a lead weight in my gut. My mind raced, connecting the dots. The sporadic, high-value transfers, often executed just below reporting thresholds in various currencies. The rapid layering, moving funds through multiple accounts in quick succession. The integration, where the laundered money was eventually blended with legitimate business revenues, making it appear clean. It was a textbook operation, but executed with a scale and sophistication that hinted at vast resources and ruthless efficiency. This wasn't the work of a small-time embezzler. This was the signature of an international crime syndicate, The numbers, my trusted companions, had betrayed me, not by lying, but by revealing a truth I wasn't prepared for. I was no longer just an accountant. I was an unwitting witness to a financial crime of staggering proportions, a glitch in the system that threatened to unravel everything. I knew, with a certainty that prickled my skin, that what I had stumbled upon was far more than an accounting error. It was a serpent in the heart of the empire, and I, Thomas, had just stepped on its tail. The game, I realized with a tightening in my chest, had just begun. The numbers, once my sanctuary, had become a labyrinth of betrayal. My office, usually a haven of quiet focus, now felt like a glass cage. Every glance through its clear walls a potential scrutiny. The previous night had been a blur of frantic verification, each confirmed anomaly a chisel chip from the bedrock of my professional trust. I had compiled the evidence with a precision bordering on obsession. Spreadsheets cross-referenced, shell companies unraveled, the flow of illicit funds starkly highlighted in crimson on my digital ledger. There was no room for error, no logical counter-argument. This was not a mistake. It was a meticulously orchestrated theft, vast and audacious. My appointment with the managing partner was set for precisely 9:15 a.m. I clutched the slim, encrypted data stick, its cold metal a small, unyielding weight in my palm. The walk to his corner office felt like a procession, each step echoing the drumbeat of my own rising trepidation. The firm's polished corridors, usually a testament to order and success, now seemed to stretch into an endless, gleaming trap. The air, usually crisp with ambition, felt thick, heavy with unspoken secrets. The managing partner's office was a study in understated power, dark wood, supple leather, and a panoramic view of the city's financial district. He sat behind a vast mahogany desk, a man whose silvered temples and tailored suit bespoke decades of navigating corporate currents. His smile, when I entered, was a practiced, almost paternal curve of the lips, yet his eyes held a distant, almost bored flicker. "Thomas," he began, his voice a smooth balm, always diligent, "what brings I to my corner of the world so early?" I laid the data stick on the polished surface, a small, defiant sentinel. "Sir, I've uncovered irregularities in the accounts of the Veridian Group. Significant irregularities. I believe it's a sophisticated money laundering operation." His gaze drifted to the data stick, then back to me, the smile faltering only slightly. "The Veridian Group, a substantial client, Thomas, and a rather complex one financially speaking." He steepled his fingers, a thoughtful pose. "Are I certain of my findings? These international structures can be quite intricate, a nuance easily missed by even the sharpest eye." "I'm certain, sir," I affirmed, my voice steady despite the tremor in my gut. "I've traced the funds through a series of shell corporations, offshore accounts, and seemingly legitimate investments. The patterns are consistent with laundering. The sums involved are staggering. It implicates several high-ranking individuals connected to a known syndicate." I detailed the key transactions, the suspicious timing, the inexplicable transfers that defied all logical business practice. I spoke of the deliberate obscuration, the layers of legal obfuscation designed to deter scrutiny. He listened, nodding occasionally, a faint frown creasing his brow, yet his attention seemed to hover, never quite landing on the gravity of my words. He picked up a solid brass letter opener, turning it idly in his hand. "Thomas, my dedication is commendable truly, but sometimes, in our pursuit of absolute clarity, we can overinterpret. These are multi-billion-dollar enterprises. Their financial architecture is often Byzantine by necessity, not by design for illicit activity." A cold prickle ran down my spine. "Sir, the evidence is compelling. I can demonstrate the circular flow, the deliberate mislabeling, the—" He raised a hand, a gentle but firm gesture. "I appreciate my thoroughness. However, stirring up such allegations, especially against a client of Veridian's stature, could have far-reaching consequences for the firm, for our reputation, even for my own trajectory here." He paused, letting the words hang in the air, a silken thread tightening around my throat. "These are delicate matters. Sometimes the most prudent course is to allow certain ambiguities to remain ambiguous. We deal in trust, Thomas." He wasn't dismissing my findings because they were flawed. He was dismissing them because they were inconvenient. The managing partner, the figurehead of integrity, was implicitly asking me to look away. "But this is illegal," I managed, the words feeling brittle on my tongue. "It's a criminal enterprise," he sighed, a sound of weary patience. "And proving that, Thomas, is a monumental task, one that could consume resources, expose the firm to litigation, and ultimately yield nothing but public scandal. Think of the families, the employees, the stability of our institution. We have a duty to protect all that we've built." He leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to a confidential murmur. "You're a bright young man, Thomas, with a promising future. Don't let one complex, perhaps even misunderstood, financial structure derail a career of such potential. This wasn't just about protecting a client. This was about protecting the firm itself, because the corruption wasn't just around the firm, it was within it. It had seeped into the very foundations, reaching higher than I had ever dared to imagine." I nodded slowly, my throat tight, the taste of ash in my mouth. The walk back to my office was a haze. The firm, my professional home, now felt like a gilded cage, and I, a bird with a broken wing, had just been warned not to sing. Later that afternoon, the need to breathe, to escape the suffocating walls of the firm, became an undeniable imperative. I drove until the city dissolved into winding coastal roads, until the smell of salt filled the air. I found myself at a coastal cave, tide coming in. The air inside was cool and damp, heavy with the scent of brine and wet rock. The rhythmic crash of waves against the entrance was a primal drumbeat, a counterpoint to the chaotic thrumming in my own head. I watched the gray-green water surge forward, licking at the rough-hewn floor, each wave a relentless advance. The tide was coming in, inexorable, just as the danger I now faced seemed to be. The managing partner's words echoed in the cavernous space, amplified by the natural acoustics. "Far-reaching consequences. Don't let one complex structure derail a career. Protect all that we've built." It wasn't just a suggestion, it was a decree. A boundary had been drawn, and I had been warned to stay on my side. A faint, metallic glint caught my eye, half buried in the wet sand near a cluster of barnacles. I knelt, digging with my bare fingers, and pulled free a small, tarnished silver locket. It was a relic, lost and forgotten, a silent testament to something once cherished, now abandoned to the elements. Like my own sense of security, perhaps. The cave felt like a maw ready to swallow secrets. I was alone here, utterly alone, with a truth too dangerous to speak aloud within the firm's walls. The path ahead was no longer about numbers and ledgers. It was about navigating treacherous currents, with the tide of corruption steadily rising around me. My meticulous nature, once a source of pride, now felt like a burden, having led me to a precipice from which there was no easy retreat. I had been warned, but the quiet resolve that had driven me to uncover the truth refused to be extinguished. It merely hardened, taking on the unforgiving resilience of the very rock that surrounded me. The subtle dismissal, the downplaying of my meticulous work, the veiled threat, it coalesced into a chilling realization. It had seeped into the very foundations, like a slow poison staining the bedrock. My stomach churned, a cold knot tightening with each beat of my pulse. The polished veneer of our glass tower, the hushed reverence of its halls, now felt like a deceptive skin over something venal and vast. They thought me a mere number cruncher, a cog in their grand, dishonest machine. But a meticulous mind, once focused, becomes an unyielding blade. My investigation, once a professional duty, had transformed into a solitary crusade. I would dig deeper, not for them, but for the principle of the thing, for the very integrity I believed still existed somewhere. My access, once granted freely, now felt like a stolen privilege. I copied files, not indiscriminately, but with a surgeon's selectiveness, pulling only the strands I knew were entangled in the larger knot. My personal drive, a small, innocuous device, became a vault of dangerous secrets. I began with the periphery, tracing the tendrils outward from the initial anomalies I'd flagged. Shell corporations, like a scattering of empty husks, appeared repeatedly across jurisdictions known for their opaque financial veils. Their registered addresses were often mail drops, their directors a revolving door of proxies. But I noticed a pattern in the timing of their formation, a subtle synchronicity that hinted at a single, guiding hand. These weren't random, isolated ventures. They were parts of a grand, orchestrated deception. One particular sequence of transactions snagged my attention, a series of multi-million-dollar transfers between an offshore entity and a seemingly legitimate construction conglomerate. The purpose codes were vague, consulting fees or development costs, but the figures themselves were disproportionately large for the stated services, especially given the conglomerate's own audited statements showed no such significant external expenditures. What truly made my breath catch, though, was the signature on a minor ancillary agreement. It was the familiar, elegant script of a senior partner within my own firm, not one of the direct overseers of the initial audit, but a figure whose influence extended like an invisible web throughout the organization. This wasn't just within the firm. It was reaching for the very top. I felt a growing sense of isolation, a phantom gaze upon my back even in the solitude of my apartment. The lines on my face deepened, etched by the blue glow of the screen and the weight of what I was uncovering. I began to doubt my own perceptions, my own sanity. There was I connecting dots that weren't there, seeing conspiracy where only complex, albeit legitimate, business practices existed, to clear my head. To escape the suffocating walls of my apartment and the silent judgment of the data, I drove. My car became a solitary vessel, carrying me away from the city's neon pulse until the air grew sharper, tasting of salt and brine. I found myself at a coastal cave, the tide coming in with a relentless, rhythmic sigh. I sat on a smooth, wave-worn stone, the spray misting my face. The water, a shimmering sheet of silver and black, crept steadily inward, consuming the sand, erasing the footprints of earlier visitors. It mirrored my situation, I realized. The tide of this corruption was rising, threatening to engulf everything, to leave no trace of what once was. My options felt like the shrinking patches of dry sand around me. I pulled out a small, encrypted drive, a physical manifestation of my dangerous obsession. On it, I had stored the most damning files, the cross-referenced data, the intricate web of shell companies, and suspicious transactions. I held it in my palm, a tiny piece of plastic bearing the weight of immense peril. There was I truly seeing what I thought I was seeing. There was I brave enough to confront it. The cave offered no answers, only the ceaseless, indifferent churn of the ocean. Yet in that vast, indifferent natural power, a different kind of resolve solidified within me. This wasn't about courage anymore, it was about necessity. The truth, however ugly, deserved to be unearthed. Back in my makeshift command center, my cramped desk at home, I returned to the data with renewed focus. The senior partner's signature on that obscure agreement. I cross-referenced it with other, seemingly unrelated deals. And there it was, faint but undeniable, a pattern, not on the main transaction documents, but on the subsidiary agreements, the minor approvals, the often overlooked appendices. His involvement was always tangential, a subtle thread woven into the tapestry. Never at the forefront, but always present, a quiet sanctioning force. This wasn't just a simple money laundering scheme. The sheer volume of transactions, the global reach of the shell companies, the deliberate obfuscation of beneficial ownership, it spoke of a vast, organized network, a syndicate far more sophisticated than I had initially imagined. The game had changed. I was no longer an auditor. I was an adversary, navigating a labyrinth built by masters of deceit. And the tide was indeed coming in. The next move I knew had to be mine. The realization, stark and chilling, had settled within me like a shard of glacial ice. It wasn't merely a client's shadowed dealings I had stumbled upon. It was the very bedrock of my esteemed firm that harbored rot. The dismissive tones, the artful deflections, the subtle but unmistakable warnings from the senior partner, they were not shields for an outsider, but bulwarks for an internal malignancy. The air in my office, once crisp with the promise of numbers aligning, now felt thick with unspoken threats, a silent pressure that pressed against my temples. I was no longer merely an accountant chasing discrepancies. I was a reluctant prospector, having unearthed a vein of poison where I had sought only gold. The world outside my window, usually a blur of indifferent city life, began to sharpen into unsettling detail. First, parked 3 blocks from my apartment building, its tinted windows mirroring the morning sky. Then days later, it materialized across from my usual coffee shop, a silent sentinel amidst the hurried commuters. Paranoia, I told myself, was a luxury I couldn't afford, a distraction from the intricate web I was trying to untangle. Yet the threads of unease tightened. A colleague, an ambitious junior who usually clung to my every word, grew strangely distant, his eyes skittering away when mine met them. My computer, typically a fortress of firewalls and passwords, exhibited a strange lethargy, an occasional hesitant pause before responding to my commands. The world, once a predictable sequence of debits and credits, now hummed with an almost imperceptible tension, a static charge in the air that only I seemed to feel. Then came the package. It arrived on my desk, unmarked, delivered by the internal mail courier who claimed no memory of its sender. Inside, nestled on a bed of shredded paper, was a single, pristine white lily, its petals impassably delicate. Beneath it, a small, polished stone, smooth and gray, the kind one might find on a remote beach. No note, no card. Just the flower, the stone, and an overwhelming sense of violation. My breath hitched. The lily, a symbol of purity often associated with funerals. Was this an idle threat or a prelude? I examined the package, the flower, the stone. For any telltale sign, a fingerprint, a smudge, anything. Nothing. I carefully placed the items in a sealed bag, a small, private piece of evidence in an investigation no one knew I was conducting. The incident solidified my resolve. This wasn't paranoia. This was real. Someone knew. Someone was watching. I began to vary my routine, a dance of evasion. Different routes to work, changing my coffee shop, even walking an extra mile just to observe. It was like trying to catch smoke. I tried to dismiss it, to tell myself I was imagining things, projecting my fears onto an innocent world. But the feeling of being an exhibit, a specimen under a microscope, gnawed at me. One evening, I made a deliberate detour, driving for miles along the winding coastal road, the ocean a vast, murmuring presence to my right. I parked my car overlooking a secluded cove, the kind of place where the land met the sea in a rugged embrace. The air was cool, carrying the sharp scent of salt and damp earth. Below, accessible by a precarious winding path, lay a coastal cave, tide coming in. I descended, the crunch of pebbles under my boots echoing in the twilight. Inside the cave, the air was cooler, heavy with the scent of brine and ancient rock. The rhythmic sigh and hiss of the waves, growing louder with each passing moment, spoke of the encroaching tide. I found a relatively dry ledge, pulling out the small, encrypted drive I carried, its contents a digital key to the firm's deepest secrets. A glint caught my eye, not from the drive, but from the damp sand near the cave's mouth. A small, polished stone, identical to the one left on my desk. It wasn't possible. This cave, this hidden place, how could they have known? The waves crashed closer, their white foam licking at the entrance, threatening to consume the small, gray marker. I scrambled forward, grabbing the stone. It was smooth, cool, undeniably the same. This wasn't a coincidence. This was a message delivered to a place I had chosen on a whim, a place I believed was secret. The walls of the cave, once a comforting embrace, now felt like the closing jaws of a trap. The sound of the tide coming in intensified, a hungry roar against the rocks, mirroring the panic that began to claw at my throat. They were not just watching me. They were anticipating my every move, predicting my need for solitude, for escape. The corruption had not just seeped into the firm, it had seeped into the very fabric of my life, a silent, pervasive poison. I was no longer merely investigating, I was being hunted. The glacial shard of realization, once merely chilling, now began to carve deep channels within me. The rot I'd glimpsed was not confined to a distant client's ledger. It had seeped into the very joists and beams of my professional life, threatening to bring the entire edifice down upon my head. The dismissive tones, the artful deflections, the subtle but unmistakable warnings, they were not the clumsy dance of the ignorant, but the deliberate movements of conspirators. My esteemed firm, a temple of precision and integrity, was in truth a gilded cage. I moved through the following days in a haze, each number on a spreadsheet, each polite nod from a colleague, feeling like a fresh layer of deception. My meticulous nature, once my greatest asset, now felt like a curse, drawing me deeper into the labyrinth. I saw their faces in the quiet hum of the server room, heard their veiled threats in the rustle of papers on a deserted desk. Sleep offered no true escape, only a darker theater for my anxieties, where the faces of my wife and daughter flickered, fragile and vulnerable, against a backdrop of encroaching shadows. The fragile peace of our home, a sanctuary I had always taken for granted, now felt like a house of cards. Each morning, watching my daughter skip out the door, her bright backpack a splash of color against the gray pavement, a knot tightened in my gut. I saw peril in every passing car, every unfamiliar face, a premonition I tried to dismiss as paranoia, a side effect of my solitary investigation. Then, the world tilted. It was a Tuesday afternoon, the kind of day that usually hummed with the mundane rhythm of school runs and grocery lists. I was hunched over a particularly thorny set of accounts, the numbers blurring when my phone vibrated, a sharp, insistent buzz. It was a call from the head teacher, his voice thin, strained, edged with a tremor that sent an immediate jolt of ice through my veins. "Thomas, there's been an incident, your daughter. She's shaken, but she's all right." Just a very close call. My hand gripped the phone, gripped tight. I didn't wait for details. The office, the spreadsheets, the carefully constructed facade, it all dissolved. I was a father propelled by a primal fear. The scene at the school gate was a knot of worried parents and hushed voices. My daughter, small and pale, was clutched by the head teacher, her face buried in the woman's skirt. When she saw me, she pulled away, running into my arms, trembling. It had missed them by mere inches, crashing into the brick wall of the school fence, showering them with dust and debris. The driver, according to witnesses, had looked dazed, then with a strange, almost calculated swiftness had reversed, abandoned the mangled vehicle and vanished into the crowd. The police officer, a stocky man with weary eyes, spoke of brake failure, a freak accident, but his gaze, when it met mine, lingered a fraction too long, a flicker of something unspoken. As I led her away, her small hand nestled in mine, my eyes caught something glinting on the broken asphalt near the crumpled truck. It was a miniature, polished silver elephant, no bigger than my thumb, an odd thing to find in the aftermath of a traffic incident. This wasn't an accident. The elephant was a symbol, a discreet, almost archaic emblem I had seen referenced in a few of the more obscure encrypted files. I'd unearthed a mark of the syndicate, a silent signature of their reach. My daughter, usually a chatterbox, stared out the window, occasionally flinching at the sound of a horn. My wife, when I finally relayed the story, held my daughter close, her eyes wide with a fear that mirrored my own. We tried to reassure ourselves, to rationalize it as a random, unfortunate event. But the silver elephant, now tucked into my pocket, burned against my thigh, a tiny, undeniable ember of malice. The air was sharp with salt and the cries of gulls. I descended a winding path, my steps echoing against the raw rock face, until I reached the mouth of a coastal cave, tide coming in. The entrance was a jagged maw carved by millennia of oceanic hunger. Inside, the roar of the waves was amplified, a primal heartbeat against the stone. The tide, a restless silver tongue, crept further into the cave with each surge, erasing the sand, swallowing the light. The cave was a vast, echoing chamber, its ceiling lost in gloom. Here, amidst the unyielding rock and the encroaching sea, I allowed the veneer of composure to crack. They had touched my child, my daughter. My illusion of safety, of a contained professional danger, shattered into a million sharp fragments, each one reflecting her terrified face. My hands clenched into fists, the silver elephant pressing painfully into my palm. This wasn't a game of numbers anymore. This was a war, and they had just declared their terms. The fear, an icy grip on my heart, began to transmute. It didn't dissipate, but hardened, sharpened into a fierce, unyielding resolve. I had always been meticulous, cautious, a man of careful calculations. It was a relentless force like the one I now faced. But I, too, could be relentless. I had tried to report, to follow the rules, to believe in the system. They had scoffed. They had threatened. Now they had touched my family. A low growl rumbled in my chest, foreign and raw. The cautious number cruncher was gone. Swallowed by the encroaching tide of my fury, I would not merely expose them, I would dismantle them, piece by agonizing piece. Let the tide come in. I would stand my ground. The world, for a fleeting, terrifying breath, had been reduced to the shriek of tires and the frantic pounding of my own heart against my ribs. The school gate, usually a bright tapestry of childhood laughter, had become a churning vortex of dread. I remember the knot of parents, their faces etched with a shared, silent panic, and then the blessed, impossible sight of a small hand, held tight by the teachers, emerging from the throng. My daughter, unharmed. Relief, a wave so potent it buckled my knees, washed over me, leaving behind a bitter residue of terror. They had tried, or perhaps it was a warning, a whisper in the wind that promised a storm. I scooped her into my arms, her small body a fragile anchor in a world suddenly unmoored. The questions the teacher asked, the sympathetic murmurs of other parents, they were distant echoes, swallowed by the roar in my ears. That night, as she slept soundly, oblivious to the precipice we stood upon, I paced the hushed rooms of our home. The carefully constructed facade of my life, the meticulous order of my profession had shattered. The numbers, once my sanctuary, now felt like a cage. My internal pleas, my attempts to report the rot from within, had been met with a wall of polite obstruction, then outright menace. My blood, usually a slow, steady river, now coursed like a torrent, hot with a primal protective fury. But the wolf, I realized, could not stand against a hydra. Its heads multiplied, its venom spread. I needed allies. A voice, amplified, that could pierce the corporate hum and expose the truth to the harsh glare of day. My mind, usually a labyrinth of figures and financial models, began to sift through faces, names, reputations. The internal compliance officer, a puppet or worse, complicit. The local law enforcement, a single voice easily drowned or corrupted. No, I needed someone outside the system, someone with a hunger for truth and a platform. A name surfaced from the forgotten depths of my past, a ghost from a different life. A former colleague, not from my firm, but from an earlier, more idealistic time. A woman who had traded the sterile confines of corporate analysis for the chaotic, often thankless, world of investigative journalism. He had been sharp, relentless, with an uncanny ability to sniff out the rot beneath the polished surface. Her reputation, however, was a double-edged sword, perfect. He had nothing left to lose and everything to prove. Contacting her was an exercise in paranoia. I left a breadcrumb trail, a coded message referencing a long-forgotten inside joke, an obscure financial scandal we'd both obsessed over years ago. A day later, a cryptic reply materialized. A single word, 8, and then coordinates, a place I knew, a stretch of rugged coastline, wild and untamed. The tide charts swam into my mind. 8, high tide, a meeting point both isolated and exposed. My stomach tightened, a knot of apprehension and nascent hope. The journey to the coast was a blur of heightened senses. I parked my rental far from the designated spot, blending into the sparse line of tourist vehicles. The wind whipped at my jacket, carrying the briny tang of the sea. The air was thick with the promise of rain, and the sky, a bruised purple, mirrored the turmoil within me. I walked the winding path down to the shore, the crunch of gravel under my worn shoes the only sound besides the ceaseless roar of the waves. The meeting point was a coastal cave, tide coming in. The air inside was cool, damp, smelling of salt and ancient stone. Small pools of seawater already gleamed on the cave floor, reflecting the faint light from the entrance, creeping further inward with each passing minute. The tide was a relentless clock, marking our borrowed time. He was already there, a silhouette against the gray light filtering in. The investigative journalist. Her posture was weary, her face etched with lines I didn't remember, but her eyes, when they met mine, still held that familiar, piercing intensity. She wore a practical waterproof jacket, her hair pulled back against the wind. No notebook, no recording device visible. Just him and the raw, untamed power of the sea. "Thomas," he said, his voice a low murmur, barely audible above the waves. No surprise, no warmth, just a flat acknowledgement. "You're looking haunted." I managed a grim smile. "The numbers, they've started talking back." "They always do," she replied, her gaze sweeping over the encroaching water. "To those who listen, what have they told you this time?" I began slowly, carefully, painting a picture with words, not figures. The shell corporations, the offshore accounts, the impossible velocities of money. I watched her face, searching for a flicker of recognition, a sign that I wasn't entirely mad. Her expression remained impassive, but her eyes, those sharp, discerning eyes, never left mine. "And you think this is tied to what exactly?" she finally asked, her voice laced with skepticism. "Another corporate giant dabbling in the gray, or something more organized?" "More," I insisted, my voice gaining strength. "Much more, and they've made it clear they don't appreciate my curiosity." I swallowed, the memory of my daughter's face at the school gate a fresh wound. "They went after my child." Her gaze sharpened, a sudden spark in the depths. "Your child," she repeated, new note entering her voice, not sympathy. She paused, her eyes narrowing, staring out at the turbulent water. "I had a contact, a source from years ago, someone deep in the shipping industry. He vanished. Said he was onto something big, something about falsified manifests, ghost ships, and routes that didn't exist on any official chart. He mentioned a name, a shell company based out of Panama, with a subsidiary registered in some obscure island nation. I dismissed it then, thought it was a dead end. But the way he described the operation, the sheer scale of it, the level of intimidation, the subsidiary, He swore it was a myth, a phantom company, yet it was the only name he ever gave me. He said they moved mountains of money and things that weren't money. The pieces, disparate and scattered, were beginning to interlock. My meticulous financial trails, her sources' desperate warnings about phantom shipping. The name Nautilus Holdings emerging from both our isolated investigations. It was a revelation, a confirmation that I wasn't chasing phantoms, a very real, very dangerous Leviathan. "This is bigger than you know, Thomas," he said, his voice now devoid of skepticism, replaced by a grim resolve. "If Nautilus Holdings is involved, if what my source claimed is true, you're dealing with ghosts who have very real teeth. They erase people, entire histories. You won't just be exposing a money laundering scheme." The cave, once a sanctuary, now felt like a trap, the water rising, threatening to seal us in. I had found an ally, yes, but the path ahead was not clearer, only more perilous. The sea, a hungry beast, gnawed at the entrance of the coastal cave, tide coming in. Each wave, a whisper of doom, surged higher, its cold breath misting my face, tasting of salt and impending confinement. The rock walls, slick with green algae, began to weep, rivulets tracing paths down to the churning pool at our feet. The contact, a silhouette against the fading light from the mouth of the cave, shifted restlessly, their gaze fixed on the darkening horizon. "They'll be here," the contact murmured, their voice a low rasp, barely audible above the ocean's roar. "They always come when the tide turns." A shiver. The sanctuary I had hoped for, this fleeting alliance, felt fragile, a thin shield against an overwhelming force. The water now reached my ankles, tugging at my shoes, promising to reclaim us both. Then a sound that wasn't the sea, a sharp, guttural shout, muffled but distinct from above. My head snapped up. Ropes, perhaps, or a sheer, practiced climb. My breath hitched. They hadn't come from the water, they'd come from the sky. Above us, I yelled, the words torn from my throat. The contact swore, a harsh expletive. They've changed their approach. Their faces were obscured by hoods, their movements predatory. "I'll buy time." Before I could protest, the contact launched themselves at the first assailant, a desperate, grappling blur of limbs. The cave echoed with the grunt of impact, the scramble of feet on wet stone. I hesitated, my mind screaming to help, but the contact's urgency, their desperate plea, burned into me. This was the moment, my chance. I plunged into the crevice, a narrow fissure that promised a way out, or perhaps a deeper trap. I stumbled, my hands scraping against rough rock. Behind me, the sounds of struggle intensified, a sharp cry, a splash, then a sickening thud. Had I just abandoned my only ally? The thought was a bitter gall in my mouth. The passage narrowed further, forcing me to turn sideways, my shoulders scraping the abrasive stone. A faint glimmer of light, a promise of freedom, beckoned ahead. But then, a new sound, footsteps behind me. Splashing through the water, closer than I dared imagine. They were pursuing me. They hadn't stopped with the contact. My heart hammered against my ribs, a trapped bird desperate for release. I could hear their heavy breathing now, the slosh of their boots. One of them was large, a lumbering presence. I risked a glance over my shoulder. My foot slipped on a patch of seaweed-covered rock. I fell, my head cracking against the unforgiving stone. A blinding flash of pain, a dizzying spin. The ledger flew from my grasp, skittering across the wet floor. Before the world could fully right itself, a hand clamped around my ankle, strong as iron. I cried out, kicking wildly, adrenaline surging through my veins. I clawed at the rock, desperate to pull myself free. The assailant, a grunting mass of muscle, dragged me back. My fingers, slick with brine and my own blood, found purchase on a jagged edge. I pulled, twisted, fought with every ounce of strength I possessed. In the chaotic struggle, as I thrashed against the iron grip, my hand brushed against something in the assailant's pocket. A small, hard object, dislodged by our violent contortions. It tumbled out, glinting briefly in the faint light before falling into the shallow water. Instinct, raw and primal, took over. As I wrenched my leg free with a desperate surge of strength, I snatched at the object. My fingers closed around it, a small, smooth piece of wood, intricately carved. Heavy despite its size, the assailant roared, a sound of pure frustration, and lunged again. But I had bought myself a precious second. I scrambled to my feet, ignoring the throbbing pain in my head and ankle. The passage ahead was still narrow, but the light was brighter now, a silver sliver. I could hear the sea again, not trapped within the cave, but open, vast. I burst out onto a small, rocky cove, the open sky a dizzying relief. He paused, scanning the desolate stretch of beach. I was exposed, vulnerable, but I had the token. I glanced down at my hand. It was a piece of wood carved into the shape of a coiled serpent, its scales meticulously detailed, its eyes tiny, vacant pits. It felt ancient, almost primordial, no ordinary trinket. This was a mark, an emblem. The assailant took a step, then another, closing the distance. My legs screamed in protest, but I forced it to move. The cove ended abruptly at a sheer cliff face. No escape that way. My gaze swept the horizon, the sea. Without a second thought, I plunged into the churning waves, the shock of the cold water stealing my breath. The token was clutched tight in my hand, a strange anchor. I pushed through the breakers, fighting the current, the salt stinging my eyes, cleansing the blood from my face. I could hear the assailant's shouts, fading slightly, swallowed by the ocean's roar. He wouldn't follow me into the open sea. They never do. The token, pressed into my palm, was my only companion, a silent, undeniable testament to the horror I had just endured. It was proof, physical and tangible, that this was not a phantom chase, not a figment of my paranoia. This was real. These were real people with real, violent intentions, leaving behind real artifacts of their clandestine world. The water was a vast, indifferent expanse. I was alone now, utterly and irrevocably alone. There was no turning back, no going home. I had escaped, yes, but the escape had only solidified my understanding. I had to go further underground, disappear completely, if I was to survive and truly uncover the coiled evil that had nearly consumed me. The coastal cave, tide coming in, swallowed the last vestiges of light, leaving only the frantic echoes of struggle. My contact, a silhouette against the gloom, a desperate, grappling blur of limbs, had become a sacrifice. Their final, urgent plea, "Run," rang in my ears, a cruel melody played by the rising water. I stumbled back, the slick stone beneath my boots treacherous, my breath ragged in the cold, salt-laced air. The sounds behind me intensified, a choked cry, a sickening thud that reverberated through the very rock. Every instinct screamed to turn, to fight, to pull them from the maw of that brutal encounter, but their words, sharp as shards of flint, had carved a path for me. Get the data out, protect your family. My hand, guided by a phantom touch, found the small, cold object pressed into my palm moments before the attack. A sliver of metal, no bigger than my thumb, intricately etched. A data chip, I surmised, though its design was unlike anything commercially available. Clutching it, a desperate anchor in a swirling storm of fear and grief, I turned. The water was already reaching my ankles, a frigid embrace, pulling at my trousers. The entrance, a jagged mouth of rock, seemed impossibly distant. I forced my legs to move, each step a testament to a will I hadn't known I possessed, scrambling over barnacled stones, the incoming waves crashing against my shins, threatening to drag me back into the hungry depths. The world outside the cave was a blur of gray dawn and driving rain. I emerged, gasping, onto a deserted stretch of shingle, the taste of salt and fear heavy on my tongue. My clothes clung to me, soaked and mud-stained. I found my car where I'd left it, a silent sentinel beneath the weeping sky. The drive back was a haze, punctuated by the rhythmic thud of the wipers and the phantom image of my contact's final moments. I was alive, yes, but stained by the survival, by the unspoken question of whether I had done enough. The quiet of my apartment was a stark contrast to the violence I had just escaped. I showered, scrubbing at the grime, trying to wash away the memory of the struggle, the smell of fear, the metallic tang that had filled the air. But the images persisted, flickering behind my eyelids. The call came mid-morning, a sterile voice from my firm. "Thomas, a meeting has been scheduled for immediately. The senior partner will be present." No preamble, no pleasantries. This was it. The other shoe, perfectly weighted, was about to drop. I arrived at the firm, a ghost in the polished halls, my colleagues' averted gazes speaking volumes before a single word was uttered. The meeting room, usually a place of quiet deliberation, felt like an interrogation chamber. The senior partner sat opposite me, flanked by a stern-faced colleague from internal audit and a legal representative whose expression was impassive as stone. "Thomas," the senior partner began, his voice devoid of its usual genial warmth, "we've uncovered some discrepancies, rather significant ones." A knot tightened in my stomach. "Discrepancies?" I asked, my voice surprisingly steady. "Indeed." The internal audit colleague pushed a thick binder across the gleaming mahogany table. Fabricated invoices, shell company transfers, millions diverted into offshore accounts. impassable, all bearing my digital signature, all linked to an account in my name. I stared at the documents, my mind reeling. The precision of the forgery, the sheer audacity of it, took my breath away. They weren't just accusing me, they were framing me, meticulously, expertly. I recognized the names of the shell companies, the specific offshore jurisdictions, the very ones I had been flagging in my own clandestine investigation. They had taken my work, twisted it, and used it as a weapon against me. "This is a setup," I answered, my voice rising. "I've been trained to expose a money laundering scheme. I have proof." "Proof of what, Thomas?" The senior partner interrupted, his gaze unwavering. "Proof of my own culpability. The evidence here is overwhelming. The firm's reputation, our clients' trust are paramount. We cannot and will not tolerate this." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. "Effective immediately. My employment is terminated. All access to firm systems has been revoked. We expect my firm property returned, and I am to vacate the premises at once. Further legal action will be pursued." The words hung in the air, each one a hammer blow. Terminated, revoked, legal action. My career, the meticulous edifice I had spent decades building, shattered in an instant. I was staring at ruin. "I am making a grave mistake," I managed, the words tasting like ash. "This is exactly what the syndicate wants. It's truly a pity." I was escorted out, the stares of my former colleagues like daggers in my back. Their pity, I knew, was laced with fear. They saw not a framed man, but a pariah, a cautionary tale. My badge was confiscated, my access card deactivated. The heavy glass doors of the firm, once a symbol of my ambition, now slammed shut behind me, sealing me out. My phone, a lifeline, felt suddenly useless. I tried calling my partner, desperate to explain, to warn her, but the call went straight to voicemail. Then I tried again and again. Nothing. Had they reached her? Or worse, had they already poisoned her against me? My mind, usually a fortress of logic, began to fray at the edges. Wait, that doesn't add up. The speed of it all, the watertight evidence, the immediate isolation. It was too perfect, too clean. I walked the streets, a man adrift. Rain-slicked pavements reflecting a distorted image of my shattered reality. My home, my family, my livelihood, all now precarious, perhaps even lost. The weight of the data chip in my pocket, the last desperate gift from a fallen ally, felt heavier than any burden I had ever carried. I was alone, utterly terrifyingly alone. The syndicate hadn't just framed me, they had meticulously dismantled my entire world. But then, a flicker. I had the chip. I had seen the truth. And my contact, in their final moments, had given their life for it. I would not let that sacrifice be in vain. The meticulous accountant was gone. In his place, a determined adversary, forged in the crucible of ruin, was beginning to stir. The firm's heavy glass doors had sealed behind me with a finality that echoed not in my ears, but in the marrow of my bones. Each step I took away from that polished monument to ambition felt like shedding a layer of skin, leaving me raw and exposed to the harsh, indifferent air. My badge confiscated, my access severed, my reputation shredded to fine dust on the winds of their carefully constructed lie. Pity, I knew, was a luxury I could not afford, especially when it was merely a thin veil for their own terror. They saw a cautionary tale. I felt like a man reborn, albeit into a crucible of despair. Where to go when every familiar path felt tainted? Every sanctuary now a potential trap. My apartment, once a haven of quiet order, now seemed a vulnerable cage. I craved the open, the wild, a place where the ocean's roar could drown out the insidious whispers of defeat. I drove, not with a destination in mind, but with an instinct, following the coastal highway until the asphalt gave way to a gravel track, then a rough-hewn path barely wide enough for my vehicle. The air grew sharp with salt and brine, a scent that cleansed as it stung. I parked by a cluster of gnarled pines, their branches bent by ceaseless winds, and descended a narrow, treacherous trail carved into the cliff face. Below, the sea churned, a restless behemoth of gray and white. I found it then, the coastal cave, tide coming in, a gaping maw in the rock, familiar from childhood explorations, now a refuge. Inside, the air was cool, damp, and smelled of ancient stone and decay. The tide, a relentless, indifferent force, crept inward, mirroring the encroaching peril of my own life. They had stripped me bare, yes, but they had not taken my mind. They had not taken the meticulous architecture of my memory, the intricate pathways of numbers and ledgers that remained etched behind my eyes. My hands, once so adept at navigating spreadsheets, felt strangely empty, yet my mind was ablaze. This was not about vengeance, not yet. This was about precision, about leverage. They thought they had buried me beneath a mountain of fabricated evidence. They thought a forensic accountant, without his firm's resources, was a toothless beast. They underestimated the tenacity of a man who had spent his life finding the invisible threads that bound illicit fortunes. My unique accounting skills, once my career's foundation, were now my only weapon. I began to reconstruct, piece by agonizing piece, the labyrinthine financial architecture I had stumbled upon. Not just the surface-level shell corporations and the offshore accounts, those were mere distractions, the smoke and mirrors for the casual observer. I needed to go deeper. My memory unfurled the complex web of intercompany loans, the subtly inflated transfer pricing agreements between subsidiaries in different jurisdictions, the almost imperceptible shifts in asset valuation. These were the true arteries of their illicit empire, designed to siphon funds while appearing legitimate. I recalled a particular series of transactions involving a seemingly innocuous philanthropic trust registered in a small island nation known for its opaque financial regulations. At the time, it had merely seemed like aggressive tax planning, a common enough practice among the ultra-wealthy clients my firm served. But now, without the constraints of corporate loyalty clouding my judgment, I saw it differently. The philanthropic trust had a peculiar habit of acquiring distressed assets at below market value, only to sell them off years later at a significant, yet not suspiciously large, profit to entities linked back to the firm's major clients. It was the timing, I realized, the synchronicity of these acquisitions and sales with specific project approvals and political shifts in certain developing nations that had always bothered me. It was too neat, too perfectly aligned. And then a flicker, a name buried deep within a subsidiary's annual report, a name attached to the trust's advisory board, alongside a myriad of legitimate high-profile figures. It was the name of a distant relative of a senior partner, a relative who, to my knowledge, had no background in finance or philanthropy. A quiet man always in the background, a mere footnote in the firm's sprawling family trees. Wait, that doesn't add up. The trust was not merely a tax dodge. It was a sophisticated conduit, a funnel. The distressed assets were not just investments. They were vessels for laundered funds, cleansed through a cycle of acquisition, holding, and resale, emerging clean on the other side. And the advisor, the quiet relative, was not just a figurehead. He was a proxy, a silent hand guiding the flow. The ultimate beneficial owner wasn't the trust itself, but someone far more powerful, using the trust as an untraceable, seemingly benevolent financial ghost. The reveal hit me with the force of a physical blow. The philanthropic trust was the spider at the center of the web, not just a strand, and the quiet relative was the weak link, the human entry point into their otherwise impenetrable fortress of paper. My plan began to crystallize, intricate and dangerous. I would expose the true nature of the trust, not by chasing every single transaction, but by meticulously demonstrating the pattern of its asset acquisitions and disposals, specifically those correlating with the firm's involvement in certain high-value international projects. I needed to show the why and the how of the quiet relative's involvement, linking him directly to the specific decisions that facilitated the laundering. My accounting skills would turn their elegant, complex system into a transparent map of their crimes. But how? How would I obtain the corroborating evidence without access? How would I present it to someone who would listen, someone incorruptible before they found me? A tremor of doubt ran through me. Was I deluding myself? A single man against an international syndicate, stripped of all resources, armed only with numbers in his head. The enormity of it threatened to crush me. No, I was not deluding myself. I had nothing left to lose but my life, and that, I realized, was a powerful motivator. My family, innocent and unaware, remained a beacon in the storm. I would not let them be dragged down by this filth. The quiet relative. He was the counter-move. He was the thread I would pull, knowing it would unravel the entire meticulously woven tapestry of their deception. I would find him, and through him I would find the proof. My path, though perilous, was now starkly defined. The screen glowed, a cold sapphire against the deepening twilight of my office. My fingers hovered, then descended, a ballet of calculated risk across the keyboard. Each keystroke was a whisper, a promise of upheaval. The numbers before me, usually a source of comfort, now throbbed with a dangerous pulse. I wasn't just manipulating data, I was weaving a snare, a digital tripwire designed to unravel a tapestry of deceit spun by unseen hands. I had spent weeks, months, tracing the ghost pathways of their ill-gotten gains. The trust, that seemingly benign entity, now lay exposed in my mind as a gaping maw. The distressed assets, once just lines on a balance sheet, were revealed as the grimy hulls of ships ferrying illicit fortunes. And the advisor, the quiet relative who had always seemed a benign fixture, was the cunning pilot of this fleet. My task now was to paint a target on that pilot's back, to illuminate the entire operation with a sudden, blinding flash. My plan was a delicate mechanism, a series of dominoes. The first phase involved a subtle, almost imperceptible alteration within the firm's public-facing ledger. Not enough to scream foul play immediately, but enough to misdirect the watchful eyes of the syndicate, to lull them into a false sense of security while I laid the real trap. I created a phantom account, a mirror image of one of their most active conduits, but with a fractional, almost invisible discrepancy in its transaction history. This ghost account, once activated, would draw their attention, making them believe I was still merely pecking at the periphery, while the true evidence, pristine and uncorrupted, was already being prepared for its journey. My breath hitched. One false digit, one misplaced decimal, and the entire edifice would crumble, burying me beneath its ruins. Not just me, but my family. Was I truly capable of this? The memory of the veiled threats, the subtle shifts in the office atmosphere, returned with an icy grip. I pushed it down, focusing on the glowing cursor. My fingers moved with renewed purpose, precise and unwavering. The changes were made. The phantom account hummed into existence, a silent siren in the digital ocean. The next phase demanded movement, a physical disengagement from the digital realm. I packed a small, nondescript bag, a burner phone, a preloaded data stick, and a single, encrypted satellite communicator. The city lights blurred as I drove, a phantom amidst the rush-hour tide. My destination was a place of solitude, a natural fortress against prying eyes and listening ears. The air grew sharper, tasting of salt and brine as I neared the coast. The road dwindled to a gravel track, then vanished altogether, replaced by a winding path through gnarled, wind-sculpted trees. I walked a precarious path along the cliff edge, the wind tearing at my clothes, until a jagged opening appeared in the rock face, the mouth of a coastal cave, tide coming in. The air inside was heavy with the scent of damp rock and decaying seaweed, a primal odor that seemed to strip away the veneer of civilization. I found a relatively dry ledge, shielded from the spray, and set down my bag. This was it, the place for the second domino. I pulled out the burner phone. My fingers, surprisingly steady, punched in a number I'd committed to memory. They should be distracted. A pause heavy with unspoken tension. Understood. The journalist is primed. They will expect a signal by dawn. What's the trigger? A timed release, I explained, my gaze fixed on the encroaching waterline. If they don't see my regular check-in by 0600, the full dataset goes public, all of it. The original ledgers, the shell corporations, the asset transfers, and the advisor's personal accounts. Everything. Risky. Voice stated, a flat observation. What if they get to you before then? My heart hammered against my ribs. Then it goes out anyway, it's my insurance. The journalist has a copy of the encrypted archive, at least there was that, a safety net however threadbare. Good, tell them to be ready. Next, the satellite communicator. This was for the journalist, a prearranged dead man's switch. I connected it to the data stick. My fingers trembled slightly as I activated the timer. 6 hours. 6 hours until the truth would be unleashed. My mind raced, reviewing every step, every contingency. Had I missed anything? Was there a flaw, a crack in my meticulously constructed plan? The phantom account, I had made it too perfect. The fractional discrepancy I'd introduced, meant to be a subtle misdirection, could also be a signature. A breadcrumb leading directly back to me if someone looked hard enough, if someone was expecting it. Wait, it doesn't add up. If they traced that phantom, they wouldn't just be distracted. They'd know I was the source. My cleverness might be my undoing. Doubt, a venomous serpent, began to coil around my resolve. I was an accountant, not a spy. My instincts were for order, for clarity, not for the murky world of double bluffs and hidden motives. What if the detective was wrong about their response time? What if the journalist was compromised? My family's faces flashed before my eyes. Their smiles, their laughter. Had I signed their death warrants with my hubris? I took a deep, shuddering breath. No, this was the only way. This was a gamble, yes, but one taken with open eyes. The flaw in the phantom account, if discovered, would only confirm my identity, not derail the trap itself. The true data, the uncorrupted truth, was already set to fly. They would know who exposed them, yes, but it would be too late to stop the cascade. The rising tide was now lapping at the very edge of my makeshift sanctuary. I stood, my legs stiff, and looked out at the churning grey water. The trap was set. The first domino had fallen. Now all that remained was the agonizing wait, as the tide of my fate and theirs rolled inexorably in. The salt spray kissed my face, a cold, insistent farewell from the sea. The coastal cave, tide coming in, now felt less like a sanctuary and more like a water-filled tomb. The satellite communicator, its small green light blinking, sat beside the data stick. 6 hours. The timer for the journalist's dead man's switch was active. 6 hours until the truth, undeniable and raw, would spill across screens far from this hidden grotto. My fingers, still trembling from the finality of that act, traced the rough, damp rock. The roar of the incoming tide grew louder, a hungry beast claiming its territory. Water swirled around my ankles, frigid and insistent. There was no time for contemplation, only for movement. I secured the communicator and the now empty data stick deep within my waterproof pack, a small, cold comfort against the encroaching chaos. My escape route, a narrow fissure in the rock face that led to a treacherous climb, beckoned with its own silent threat. Each handhold was slick with moisture, each foothood precarious. The wind, a mournful lament, clawed at my clothes as I ascended, leaving the gurgling more of the cave behind. The world above was a tapestry of gray, a bruised sky mirroring the turmoil within me. My destination was a grand hotel ballroom, a place of polished surfaces and manufactured smiles, where the firm's annual investor gala was already in full swing. It was a stage I had meticulously set, a trap I hoped would ensnare the very architects of this corruption. The journey was a blur of calculated risks. A stolen car, a circuitous route to avoid surveillance, the anxious glances at the clock on the dashboard. Each minute that passed was a tightening knot in my gut. What if my timing was off? What if the authorities, alerted by the journalist, arrived too late? What if my carefully constructed web of evidence, so clear in the quiet of my mind, unraveled under the harsh glare of public scrutiny? This was it, the precipice. I slipped into the hotel through a service entrance. My appearance, a disheveled accountant in slightly damp, hastily donned evening wear, drawing only fleeting, disdainful glances from the event staff. The murmur of polite conversation, the clinking of crystal, and the soft strains of a string quartet drifted from the ballroom, a stark contrast to the violent symphony of the ocean I had just left. I felt like an alien, a phantom among the glittering crowd, yet my purpose burned with an almost painful clarity. The ballroom was a dazzling spectacle of chandeliers and expensive fabric. The air hummed with a manufactured geniality. I scanned the room, my eyes cutting through the superficial sheen, searching for the faces I had come to expose. There, on a raised dais, stood the senior partner, a man whose smile I now knew was a carefully constructed mask over a cavern of deceit. Beside him, a quiet, almost invisible individual. The true nexus of the syndicate's operations within the firm watched the room with unnerving composure. I moved towards the back of the dais, where the technical crew managed the presentation screens. My plan was audacious, bordering on suicidal, but it was the only way to ensure maximum impact. The small USB drive, containing the distilled essence of my findings, felt heavy in my palm. The firm's quarterly report presentation was about to begin. The large projection screens, currently displaying the firm's logo, were my canvas. "Excuse me," I murmured to a young technician, my voice surprisingly steady. The senior partner requested an urgent update to the asset allocation slide, a last-minute change. I held up a forged memo, carefully crafted days ago, bearing a convincing imitation of the senior partner's signature. The technician, flustered by the urgency and the apparent authority, nodded. "Of course, sir." Which port, with a practiced ease that belied the tremor in my hands, I inserted my USB drive into the console, navigating the familiar interface of the presentation software. A few swift clicks, a quick override of the current display. I selected the file, a stark, damning compilation of shell corporations, illicit transfers, irrefutable connections to the international syndicate. "Wait, what are you doing?" the technician suddenly stammered, his eyes widening as the firm's logo dissolved, replaced by a dense, scrolling ledger of transactions, names, dates. My meticulous work now laid bare, too late. A collective gasp rippled through the ballroom. The polite chatter died, replaced by an ominous hush. All eyes, including those of the senior partner and the syndicate's representative, were now fixed on the towering screens. The projected figures, once abstract numbers in a spreadsheet, now coalesced into a horrifying narrative of greed and betrayal. I stepped forward, seizing the microphone from the podium, its cold metal a shock against my skin. "Ladies and gentlemen," my voice resonated, amplified and echoing through the sudden void of silence. It was deeper, more resonant than I remembered, imbued with the weight of my journey. "You are witnessing the true financial report of this prestigious firm." The senior partner's face, moments ago composed, twisted into a mask of fury and disbelief. He started towards me, his eyes blazing with a predatory rage. "Thomas, what is the meaning of this madness?" "The meaning," I replied, my gaze unwavering, locking onto his, "is that this firm is a front, a sophisticated laundering operation for an international crime syndicate." I gestured to the screens, where the data scrolled relentlessly, each line a nail in their coffin. Every shell corporation, every offshore account, every illicit transfer, I have it all, and it's not just here. The syndicate's representative, usually so impassive, now had a flicker of genuine panic in his eyes. He exchanged a quick, furtive glance with a group of burly individuals positioned discreetly around the room. I knew their role. They were the muscle, the enforcers. What if I hadn't prepared enough? The seed of doubt I had planted had taken root. "This is a desperate fabrication," the senior partner roared, his voice cracking, losing its veneer of authority. "A disgruntled employee attempting to sabotage the firm. Is it?" I challenged, my voice rising to meet his. "Why did my enforcers threaten my family? Why did I obstruct every internal attempt to expose this?" I pointed to a specific transaction detail flashing on the screen, a transfer to a known shell company. That particular payment, senior partner, was to an individual who facilitated the disappearance of a key witness, a witness who tried to speak out, just as I am now. The crowd erupted. A cacophony of shouts, gasps, and frantic camera clicks filled the ballroom. The syndicate's representative, his face now pale, barked an order. The enforcers began to move, converging on me with grim intent. But then, a different kind of authority entered the room. The main doors burst open, revealing a phalanx of uniformed officers and plainclothes detectives. The lead detective, a familiar stoic figure, held up a hand. "Nobody moves. This entire area is secured." My breath hitched. They were here. The journalist, my dead man's switch, had done their work. The 6 hours hadn't even fully elapsed, but the preemptive alert, the carefully orchestrated plan, had brought them. The senior partner's face drained of all color. The syndicate's representative, seeing the game was truly up, made a desperate lunge for the nearest exit, only to be intercepted by 2 burly officers. The enforcers, caught between their orders and the overwhelming presence of the law, hesitated, then slowly began to put their hands up. I stood on the dais, the microphone still clutched in my hand, the damning evidence still scrolling across the screens. The weight of the world seemed to lift, replaced by a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. The fight was far from over, but the truth finally had been unveiled. And I, Thomas, the cautious number cruncher, had become its reluctant but determined herald. The salty kiss of the sea air, usually a balm, now carried the metallic tang of fear and the acrid scent of disruption. I stood, a statue carved from exhaustion, in the maw of the coastal cave, tide coming in. The water, a relentless tongue, licked closer to my worn shoes. Each whisper against the sand, a chilling reminder of how close I had come to being swallowed whole. Around me, the scene was a tableau of controlled chaos. Flashing lights, muted by the gray light of dawn, strobed across the rough-hewn rock. Uniformed figures moved with purpose, their voices low and urgent. The senior partner, his face a mask of crumpled dignity, was being led away, his wrists bound by the cold gleam of steel. His eyes, when they met mine, held no anger, only a profound, bottomless despair. He looked like a man watching his entire world crumble to dust, and for a fleeting, unsettling moment, I felt a tremor of something akin to pity. Then I remembered the ledger, the threats, the labyrinthine deception that had nearly cost me everything, and the pity evaporated like mist. The syndicate's representative, a figure of predatory elegance even in defeat, offered a thin, venomous smile as two officers escorted him past. He was a serpent, merely caged, not crushed. That knowledge was a lead weight in my gut. A hand, firm and reassuring, settled on my shoulder. It was the detective, his face grim but relieved. "Thomas, I did it." His words were a low rumble against the din. I could only nod, my throat tight. My limbs felt heavy, my mind a fog of too many sleepless nights. They moved me from the cave, past the receding tide, to a makeshift command post set up on the bluff, overlooking the churning gray expanse. The journalist, a whirlwind of quiet intensity, was already there, speaking animatedly into a small recorder, her eyes bright with a professional zeal that both impressed and unnerved me. She offered a brief, knowing glance, a silent acknowledgement of our shared victory. My dead man's switch had functioned flawlessly. Hours bled into a blur of statements, detailed accounts, and the slow, meticulous piecing together of the puzzle I had so desperately tried to solve alone. I recounted the financial anomalies, the coded transactions, the digital breadcrumbs, the obstruction I faced at every turn. Each word was a shard of memory, painful to retrieve but vital. The evidence, painstakingly gathered and encrypted, was now in the hands of those who could wield it with the force of law. The senior partner's initial cooperation was limited, the detective stated later, leaning forward across a folding table laden with documents. But once we presented him with my detailed ledger, the scale of the operation, and the direct threats I received, he began to sing. He hadn't just been a victim of circumstance, he had chosen his path. The firm, another investigator, a younger woman with sharp, intelligent eyes, added, is in freefall. The preemptive alert, the swift action, it hit them hard. Raids are underway at multiple international branches. The damage is catastrophic. Your name, Thomas, is being cleared. The narrative is shifting from disgruntled employee to courageous whistleblower. The words felt distant, like echoes in a vast chamber. Cleared, whistleblower. These were labels I hadn't sought, burdens I hadn't anticipated. My meticulous world of numbers had been shattered, replaced by a chaotic landscape of public scrutiny and legal battles. The professional cost was immediate and brutal. My career, as I had known it, was a casualty. How could I ever return to the quiet, methodical work I loved, with the specter of this scandal clinging to me? Later that day, as the first news reports flickered across a television screen in a secure, anonymous building, I watched the firm's logo, once a beacon of corporate respectability, flash beneath headlines screaming, "Global laundering ring uncovered," and senior partners arrested. The image of the building, my former workplace, now swarming with reporters and official vehicles, felt alien. It was a monument to ambition and betrayal, and I, Thomas, had been the one to bring it down. The emotional toll was a slow, insidious burn, relief mingled with a profound weariness. The constant vigilance, the gnawing fear for my family, had left scars that would not easily fade. I found myself flinching at sudden noises, scrutinizing every passing face. The world, once a predictable canvas of logic and order, now felt perpetually tinged with an underlying menace. Had I truly protected my family, or merely exposed them to a different kind of danger, the lingering shadow of a powerful, vindictive enemy? This doubt, a tiny, persistent worm, burrowed into the corners of my mind. The detective returned, a stack of files in his hands. "We're still uncovering the full extent, Thomas. The syndicate's reach, it's deeper than even your initial projections indicated. The money wasn't just being laundered through the firm's accounts, it was being used to fund operations in at least 5 other countries. Arms dealing, resource exploitation, illicit trade in antiquities. This wasn't just about moving dirty money, it was about fueling a vast, insidious network that touched every corner of the globe." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "Your ledger, your meticulous tracking, it gave us the key to unraveling not just the financial threads, the operational ones. We've made arrests across 3 continents already based on the intelligence you provided. It's a significant blow, a crippling one even, a crippling blow. I had wanted to expose the truth, to stop the flow of illicit funds, but I had not fully grasped the monstrous scale of what I was uprooting. The The syndicate was not merely a group of criminals. It was a hydra, and I had only severed one of its heads. The tide might have receded from the cave, but a new, deeper current had been set in motion, and I was still caught in its relentless pull. The sea, a restless breath, surged into the coastal cave, tide coming in, each wave a percussive whisper against ancient stone. I stood at its mouth, the salt spray a cool benediction on my face, watching the gray-green water claw at the shore. It had been weeks since the last tremors, weeks since the world I knew had shattered and reformed, leaving me standing on a different, unrecognizable ground. The air here, sharp with iodine and ozone, felt like a cleansing. I remembered the Hydra, its many heads, each one a tendril of corruption, reaching into the very fabric of legitimate enterprise. My crippling blow had been less a single strike and more a meticulous dismantling, a patient unraveling of threads I had once woven with such detached precision. The sheer scale of it, the intricate web of shell companies and offshore accounts, had once been an intellectual puzzle. Then it became a monstrous, living thing, threatening to swallow me whole. The image of that last, desperate scramble in the docklands still flared behind my eyelids sometimes, the cacophony of sirens and shouts replacing the roar of the ocean. The discovery, then, had not been a grand revelation of a hidden mastermind, but the chilling understanding of how deeply embedded the rot truly was. It wasn't one man, one figurehead, but a pervasive culture, a silent agreement amongst powerful individuals that the rules simply did not apply to them. My detailed ledgers, the coded transactions I had painstakingly decrypted, had laid bare the skeletal structure of their empire, allowing the authorities to sever limb after limb. It hadn't been a Hollywood explosion, but a slow, methodical implosion. A collapse from within, triggered by my relentless pursuit of the numbers. The fear, however, was a phantom limb, an ache I still carried, a constant low thrum beneath the surface of my new calm. Would it ever truly fade? Could I ever look at a balance sheet again without seeing the potential for poison? I doubted it sometimes. The old Thomas, the one who meticulously balanced books in hushed offices, felt like a ghost, a former self I barely recognized. He had been naive, shielded by the illusion of order. The new Thomas carried scars, visible only to himself, but they were etched deep. My wife, her eyes still held a flicker of that old fear, but it was receding, replaced by a fierce, quiet strength I hadn't known she possessed. We had moved, of course. A quiet coastal town, miles from the gleaming towers where I once charted fortunes. Our children, resilient as young saplings, were slowly finding their laughter again, chasing gulls on the beach, their innocence a balm. I watched them sometimes, their small figures silhouetted against the setting sun, and a profound gratitude would wash over me, thick and sweet like honey. The transition hadn't been easy. I had tried to return to the world of numbers, tentatively for a local charity, but the old joy was gone, replaced by a lingering suspicion. Every figure felt suspect, every transaction a potential lie. It was a disheartening realization, a moment of doubt where I questioned if I had broken myself in the process of breaking them. Could I ever trust the world of finance again, or myself within it? Then an unexpected call, not from a firm, but from a small, dedicated government agency, their mandate the prevention of financial crimes. They offered me a different path, one where my unique blend of accounting prowess and street-hardened pragmatism could be used, not to chase profits, but to safeguard integrity. It was public service, yes, but more than that, it was a chance to wield my particular set of skills as a shield, not a sword, to spot the early signs of rot, to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. The tide had fully turned now, the water a churning expanse reaching for my feet. I stepped back, away from the cave's maw, its secrets swallowed by the ocean's rhythm. The air was cooler, the light fading into a twilight purple. I was no longer a forensic accountant in a prestigious firm. I was Thomas, yes, but a different Thomas. One who had walked through fire and emerged, singed but not broken. One who understood the fragility of order and the insidious nature of greed. The journey ahead would be long, filled with its own unique challenges, but I would face them, my family by my side, the echoes of the ocean reminding me that even after the fiercest storms, the world kept turning, always moving towards a new dawn.